Good evening, friends in person and online. This is the second lecture of our series by research affiliates that come from Norway to the Norwegian Institute. Actually, this is a very interesting pillar introduced by Dr. Zafiriadis when he joined the Institute. He thought, well, we have to comply with our new strategy plan, and our new strategy plan is to reinforce research, teaching and dissemination at the Institute. So since 2022, we have a completely new policy at the Institute, and this is part of it. So his strategic idea was to bring a lot of Norwegian scholars to stay with us at the offices here and do the research if they can find links with the Greek community, Greek counterparts, and Greek research. So welcome. You should know that this is a possibility, that we are very open to the Norwegian university sector, also from this perspective. I would also like to say hi and welcome to Julia Frigueiro, if I'm correct in pronouncing your name, and your spectacular research combining cognition and classical studies. So the floor is yours, Pasquale, to officially introduce Julia, and enjoy the evening.
Just briefly, all right. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's lecture. It is our pleasure to introduce Dr. Julia Frigerio, an accomplished scholar specializing in classical studies and cognitive archaeology. Dr. Frigerio holds a BA in classical studies from the University of Pavia at Borromeo College. She later earned an MA in archaeology from the University of Oxford and completed a PhD in classical archaeological studies at the University of Kent, focusing on cognitive archaeology. Her innovative research combines archaeological evidence with cognitive analysis to explore ancient divinatory practices, shedding new light on the interpretations of rituals associated with Apolline divination in sanctuaries such as Delphi, Claros, and Didyma. Currently, Dr. Frigerio is a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oslo, working within the FEMBOD project. Her work in this project reevaluates women's agency in Greek world, particularly focusing on the interaction of female bodies in sacred spaces. In today's presentation, Dr. Frigerio will delve into the cognitive processes underlying ancient divinatory practices, offering a fresh perspective on how ancient Greeks interpreted communication with the divine. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Frigerio.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here. Thank you, Pascalis, for the beautiful presentation. So, it's not okay. So within this presentation, I'm going to talk about research developed during my PhD. And the results of this project are also the reason why I decided to focus on female bodies in sacred spaces for my current postdoctoral research. So, as you can see from the screen, in the past years, many interpretations of Apolline divinations in ancient Greece attributed the behavior of the oracle to hallucinogenic substances and to an altered state of mind. So scholars looked for chemical substances in the lower branches the Pythia was probably chewing during the ritual, in the water of the sacred springs, and in the sacred vapor emanating from the earth in Delphi. All these ideas have already been disproved, and they've been controverted following chemical analysis that did not find hallucinogenic substances in a quantity which is high enough to prove an altered state of mind of the prophet and of the pilgrims in any of the places where Apolline divination was practiced. So today, the questions still remain open. So what was actually going on during the process of divination? Why did the Greeks believe in the words of the prophet? Was the Promantis sincere? So I approached this issue from a cognitive perspective, that of the prophetess, and that of the ancient oracle seekers. And I consider the cognitive stimuli that contributed to this experience. And these cognitive stimuli led them to honestly believe that communication with the god did occur. And during this communication, Apollo was truly revealed his wishes to mankind. So specifically, this presentation is part of a bigger study published in a scholarly monograph, A Cognitive Analysis of the Main Apolline Divinatory Practices. This study analyzed the landscape, the architecture, and the material culture of the sanctuaries of Delphi, Claros, and Didyma. But for the sake of this presentation, we will only focus on the architecture at Delphi, Claros, and Didyma very briefly, and on selected pieces of material culture. Okay, so just a quick look at the table of contents for today. So after an overview of the general methodology, we will dive into the case studies, and I will explain the relevant cognitive theories only once we mention them in relation to the material culture or the architecture. Okay, so cognitive archaeology. The cognitive approach. Cognitive archaeology has been used to read the archaeological evidence through the eyes of the ancient Greek person. How? I started from the premise that the ancient Greek person, the ancient human brain functioned much like it does today in its biological and psychological mechanism. So studies have proven that the major modifications to the human brain happen during the development from Homo habilis to Homo erectus and finally to Homo sapiens, whose brain was almost the same as ours today. As such, I applied the findings of modern neuroscience to reconstruct the association that the material culture and the architecture of the case studies were generating in the ancient Greek mind. Although the functioning of the brain might be the same, we must also consider that our brain is culturally constructed. In this regard, the concept of habitus, as defined by Pierre Bourdieu, is fundamental for understanding this interpretation of the impact of the material culture and architecture on divination. So each society's habitus is a system which generates perceptions, appreciations, and practices, and that directs human actions and cognition. On the same line, I considered the concept of mundane knowledge. This kind of knowledge is contained in large amounts by the cognitive system and helps with putting objects into predefined categories. So once the object has been put in one of these categories, categorical knowledge provides rich inductive inferences that guide our interaction with it. So mundane knowledge helps our orientation in the social system and in the wider world. This means that human cognition can be affected both by external stimuli and by stored knowledge and innate biases in our brain. So this research took into consideration both these factors by considering not only the universal neuroscientific mechanism that guide the functioning of the brain in the circumstances analyzed, but also the specific cultural context and biases that may have affected the ancient Greek mind. This gives value both to the biological and the semiotic aspects of human. How? First of all, in order to set the cognitive study in the correct framework, an assessment of the symbolic and social context is important to reconstruct the habitus of the period under investigation as far as possible. This entails a deep analysis of the cultural background through primary sources, archaeological evidence, landscape reconstructions, and so on. On the other hand, the other half of the methodology has its foundations in a neuroscientific study of the human brain and its associations. So to conclude with the premises, a disclaimer is needed. We need to consider the fact that our analysis will never be as precise as to the cognition of the single individual. However, it is also true that people in the past were much more integrated and whole than we fragmented moderns. Only a small percentage of the society had the possibility of reading, learning, studying, leading to a major proneness to trust and accept common beliefs as the only truth. So common beliefs were much more unified and controlled by centralized tradition, rituals, and religion. Religion was public and communal rather than individual and private. Therefore, the general experience of a group or category of individuals is likely to be close to individual experience within a group. Okay, let's start with the first object, the omphalos. And you can see on the slide the physical properties of the object in pink and the symbolic, the symbolic properties in pink and the physical properties in orange. And this should help you orientating in the next slides as well. Okay, so the omphalos was believed by the Greeks to be the center of all the earth, as Pausanias writes in his description of Greece. And that's the translation of the line in Greek that you can see on the slide. So what is called the omphalos by the Delphians is made of white marble and is said by the Delphians to be the center of all the earth. As such, the omphalos was first of all the emblem of Delphi's centrality and holiness. It reminded the worshippers of the political and the religious importance of Delphi. However, this is not the only symbolic meaning that can be ascribed to the stone navel. Following the tradition introduced by the Homeric hymn to Apollo, literary sources confirm the belief that the omphalos stands there in memory of the original owner of the oracle, Ge or Gaia. So according to this tradition, either Ge or her son Python, represented as a snake, were the original goddess and owner of the oracle of Delphi. Only later, Apollo acquires the ownership of Delphi from them in one of these two ways. So either Ge willingly gives it to him as a gift, or he steals it from her violently. So after the defeat of Python, the omphalos is kept at the sanctuary. So scholars have claimed that at this point, the navel stone becomes a symbol of the new patriarchic order established by Zeus and Apollo after defeating Ge. But I argue that this block of marble that is a visible connection to the chthonic power that is still in some way in Delphi, that still keeps an authority on the place, is actually a connection between between Delphi and the power of Ge, the power of the earth. So a clear link with the cult of Ge that originally owned the place. And in fact, the omphalos represented for the Greeks a clear connection with divination. If we think, for example, of Cretan divination, they already used a shapeless stone, the so-called beetle, that was viewed as the conduit for religious worship and for prophecies and for oracular messages. Moreover, the word omphalos itself was used as the word for navel, a clear reminder to maternity through the umbilical cord, to something peculiar of the female body and to the act of carrying a child. At the Oracle of Delphi, the Pythia, being a woman, was important also for the anatomy of her body, as we will see better in the next few slides. So notably, the female body has the capacity to carry life, which basically means that it can host someone else inside. And these are perfect premises for performing a ritual that lets the god speak through yourself. The fact that such an important role as the one of the oracle was covered by a priestess and that everything at the sanctuary was depending on her clearly disagrees with the idea of a new patriarchal order that got the better of female power on the oracle. As such, I believe that the omphalos stands there as a reminder to the chthonic authority that still influences the sanctuary, with a process of divination that was held underground, closer to the center of the earth, and by a female officiant. To conclude with the omphalos, in the case of the Delphic stone, the word omphalos was also used interchangeably with the word stoma, the Greek word for mouth, opening. And the navel stone was penetrated by a hole, like a proper opening or mouth. And a possible interpretation could be that originally this stone was placed above, right over the chasm where a sacred gas was coming from, so that the vapor was entering the omphalos and exiting from the hole on top of it, giving the idea of Apollo's holy breath coming out of this sacred mouth. Supporting this thesis, A Greek-based painting portrays a scene of Sophocles' Electra where Apollo is seated on the Omphalos, Laurel crowned, while the Pythia is seated on the tripod behind him, almost giving the idea that the first sacred object where Apollo is present inside the aduton is the Omphalos itself. Moving to the tripod, when we look at the tripod in the primary sources, we find that the tripod is often used as the emblem for divination. And for example, in Apollodorus, Heracles is even described in his attempt to institute an oracle of his own through the stealing of the Delphic tripod, as if it was the fundamental instrument for a successful act of divination. It is worth noticing that the tripod also appears in the primary sources as a gift to the wisest, an award for the best poet. Building on this, I argue that the tripod might have been a symbol for inspiration, so poetical inspiration at first and divine inspiration consequently. The adjective inspired is often referred to the Pythia during the process of divination. Supporting this hypothesis, in Euripides' Ion, the tripod is described as the symbol of oracular knowledge, with Ion saying that who that sits near the tripod can handle problems. In this regard, we must also consider that poets sang the poems. Poetical inspiration was musical inspiration, and Apollo was the god of music. And besides, before singing, poets invoked the muses to tell them what to sing, the correct version of the story. They were thus behaving as an instrument in the hands of the muses that were speaking through them, a phenomenon which is relatable to the way the Pythia was divinizing at Delphi. Moreover, we can safely claim that the tripod was an object that was well known to the Pythia and the Greek people as well, together with its function. So let's investigate briefly the cognitive processes related to a well-known object, because it's quite insightful in this case. So it has been proved by neuroscience that a repeated exposure to a tool's design function causes the activation of motor programs associated with that function and purpose whenever the tool is encountered. And when in front of a tool, conceptualized for a particular purpose, this phenomenon called functional fixedness blocks every alternative and more creative uses of the object. As a result, it is... I believe we were talking about functional fixedness and how it blocks every alternative or more creative ways of using an object. So as a result, it is difficult for a human to use a tool for a diverse function than its designated one. So this means that anytime we encounter a familiar object, our mind reacts in consequence in almost the same way. Like for example, let's think of a fork. When we look at a fork, the only thing we think when looking at a fork is grab it from a specific point in the object and grabbing food with the other side. So it is very likely that this described phenomenon was happening in the mind of the Pythia when constantly dealing with the same object that has become familiar to her. And the only function she could ascribe to it was the divinatory one. So to finish with the spatial and physical properties of the tripod, at Delphi, the tripod was used as a seat. So the physical features of objects can facilitate and guide perception. In the case of the tripod, it had been made of bronze in an elongated shape. The three long legs surround the breach in the earth from which the sacred gas was emerging. They go up following the same direction, giving the idea of connecting the two parts it was in contact with. The chasm in the earth on one side, and whoever was seated on the tripod on the other side. In some representations, the tripod is also depicted with a bronze ring keeping together the three legs. In this way, the functionality of canalizing the sacred gas is even more stressed. The Pythia was seated on top of it when she was divinizing. So the visual appearance it gives is that its main function was to canalize the sacred gas towards the seat, which was open. Therefore, sitting on it, the prophetess became the second part of the mechanism, which is the one intended to receive the sacred gas, almost as an extension of the tripod. As a consequence, the act of sitting on the tripod was possibly representative of welcoming the god inside. Okay, moving to the last piece of material culture, probably the most, perhaps the most interesting one. We're talking about the laurel now. So it is common knowledge that in ancient Greece, the laurel was considered to be sacred to Apollo. In the primary sources, the description of Apollo often includes the laurel in some way. And according to Diodorus Siculus, it was even Apollo who discovered the laurel. So a very strong evocative affordance of the laurel must be ascribed to its mythological background. The myth of Apollo and Daphne gives an etiological account for the association of the laurel with Apollo. So wanting to remain unmarried and chaste for the rest of her life, the nymph Daphne was running away from Apollo, who was chasing her, desiring her body. At this point, the most popular version of the myth narrates that Daphne's father, the river Peneus, turned the nymph into a laurel tree to save her virginity. However, according to other versions of the myth, it is the earth herself that transformed her into the sacred tree. So another element stressing the importance of death on the land of Delphi. But in both cases, from this moment on, Apollo made the plant sacred to him and vowed to wear it as clothing. It is yet to be noticed that both these versions of the myth are quite late. So they're indeed the final description of a mythological character that is well analyzed, that is more complex and part of a wider picture that is well analyzed by Fontenrose in his book Orion. So summarizing his analysis here, the origins of Daphne trace back to the figure of Artemis Daphneia. And she then became known in the tale as Daphne and was considered a distinct person from Artemis. But just as Artemis, she is a leader of a band of maiden huntresses. And in a hymn attributed to her, the Delphic prophetess calls herself Artemis and claims to be Apollos' wedded wife, his sister, and his daughter. In another version of the myth, Daphne is Tiresias' daughter, who was offered to Apollo at Delphi when the Pigonoi reduced Thebes. According to this tale, she had more mantic skills than the father himself, and as an inspired speaker of oracles, she was called the Delphic Sibyl, also known as Erophile. Additionally, according to Eustathius, Daphne was the daughter of Ladon and Ge, being the first woman on earth, and later she also became her mother's Promantis, so Ge's Promantis, at Delphi before the advent of Apollo. This figure as well has probably the same origins as Daphne, Erophile, and Artemis. Considerable reflections can be dedicated in regard to this mythological background, especially considering that during divination, the Pythia was not only carrying laurel branches, but she was also wearing a laurel wreath. So I argue that the carrying and the wearing of laurel branches were leading the Pythia to identify herself with Daphne. First of all, her need and desire to be chaste and pure corresponded with the virginal status of the nymph. Furthermore, there is plenty of myths in the cultural background of ancient Greek people in which a god manages to have sex with a human being in the shape of an animal or a natural element, the gas in this case, in the case of Delphi. On top of that, the prophetess was wearing the dress of a maiden, an aspect which matches the nymph's age. As such, the perspective of the chaste Pythia personifying Daphne, finally reached and owned by Apollo that entered her body in the shape of vapor, was appealing to the eyes of the worshippers of the time. In the moment of the physical encounter, united to Apollo, the priestess was inspired by the god and spoke for his desire. And this association, this personification with Daphne is understandable if we consider that our brain always keeps track of any changes in body shape and postures to guide actions in space. So this means that in normal conditions, we're always fully aware of the position of our body in the surrounding environment. And in order to do so, the brain updates the representation of the body, the so-called body schema. And it has been suggested that this body schema is plastic, as in easily molded, which means that it can incorporate external objects, and inside the adult tone, this can easily relate to the laurel branches. So we've already mentioned the mnemonic symbolic power of this specific kind of tree, which reminds of the myth of the nymph loved and chased by Apollo. The leaves on the body of the Pythia and the branch in her hands have the capacity to break the spatial coincidence of her body that is now entwined with the deepest meaning of the laurel. Just like the act of a man grasping a sword is more than a mechanical one, being also an act of incorporation, which, and I'm quoting here Malakporis, provides a new basis for self-recognition and self-awareness. The Pythia is subject to the same process of recognition through objectification. Going back to the example of the man grasping the sword, while he does that, he's not a man with a sword anymore, but he becomes a knight. In the same way, the Pythia grasping the laurel branches isn't a simple woman carrying laurel branches anymore, but she's Daphne now. To move on with other evocative properties of the laurel, we must mention that a passage of the ritual that prepared the Pythia to the act of divination probably involved the chewing of the laurel. This plant was often associated with the idea of poetical inspiration as well. Notably, a late authority even claims that the laurel itself, when burnt, served to induce prophecy. From the 5th century BC onwards, there is evidence that chewing the laurel was believed to bring a person in touch with the gods. As such, it was frequently used by prophets and poets to invoke inspiration. Despite the chemical analysis proved the laurel not to contain hallucinogenic substances, at least in a quantity that is high enough to alter one person's consciousness, I argue that this idea of an inspiring plant could have influenced the process of divination to a certain extent. The chewing of the laurel could have had a placebo effect on the Pythia, making her believe that the plant was helping her with finding inspiration. And finally, another interesting feature of the laurel is the one highlighted in the medical literature of the time, because the plant is mentioned more than once in the Hippocratic corpus with the following uses: to expel a fetus after an abortion, to help in case a woman fails to become pregnant, as a medication in case a woman's uterus twisted upon itself, and to open up the mouth of the uterus. So it clearly appears that the laurel was believed to have properties that help women with gynecological diseases, in particular, diseases that concern the obstruction of a woman's channel. In this regard, it is also interesting that ancient Egyptian medicine believed that all the orifices in a woman's body were connected and communicated through an open channel. The Egyptian medical papyri also claims that the channel between the vagina and the mouth had to be free from obstructions, otherwise a woman could not conceive, could not get pregnant. It also reports that the bodily channel of a woman was free if it was possible to smell from her mouth the garlic put in her vagina the day before. And this belief is also accounted for in the Hippocratic corpus, in the Hippocratic tradition, and in Serram's gynecology, in a period which is thus a little later than the one considered here, but the fact that this piece of information was also considered, was also included in and known in Egypt, at least since the late dynastic period, so 7th to 4th century BC, this can suggest that it might have been known in archaic Greece too. This aspect brings our attention not only to the centrality of the female anatomy in Delphi's process of divination, but also to the modality of the encounter between the god and the prophetess. So if the laurel opens up the main channels in a woman's body, and in a healthy body, the genitals were believed to be connected, directly connected to the mouth, we could argue that whatever entered from the genitals would come out from the mouth. So in medical literature, this was the case for smoke from fumigation, while here it is the case of Apollo himself as smoke coming out from the mouth of the Pythia. I'd ask claim that the presence of the laurel, might also have been seen as an ulterior aid for the Pythia to welcome the god inside her body. But let's move now to Claros and Didyma. So here we're talking about Asia Minor in the Hellenistic period. In Claros' Adaton, we can find a monolith made out of gray blue limestone, which is an Omphalos. And it's very similar to the one found in Delphi. And in the same way as at Delphi, chthonic power was also influencing Claros and its divinatory practices. If at Delphi, Ge was the original owner and worshipped goddess, at Claros, a high number of votive figurines of Cybele were found in the proximity of the temple, and they prove that the cult of the mother goddess Cybele was also present at the place before the cult of Apollo, and that a chthonic influence on the place persists at Claros, and it is derived from the earth goddess. Together with the Omphalos, a tripod is also present in the underground room at Claros. And the presence of the tripod reminded the prophet and the worshippers of all the things linked to the objects, so a symbol for inspiration and a connection to the god. However, it is possible that the first connection appearing in their mind was mainly the link with the most famous tripod, so the Delphic one, appearing as a kind of justification or validation of the divinatory practices at Claros, developed much later than the Delphic ones. Moving to Didyma instead, two elements were definitely present in the adyton during the process of divination, an axle and lower branches. It has been hypothesized that the promantist sat on the axle while divinizing, a reading I agree with and which marks the axle as the Dydimian counterpart of the Delphic tripod. As for the laurel, it was present throughout the sanctuary. So the oracle carried a wand made out of wood of a laurel tree. She wore a laurel wreath that was kept together by a white cloth, and bay trees grew everywhere in the adyton. If we also consider that the oracle was a woman and that a sacred spring was also present in the ritual, the usage of the Delphic formula is quite evident. However, the imitation of Delphi ends where the laurel is not only kept and worn by the prophetess, but is also omnipresent in the adyton. So the quantity of the sacred plant present at Didyma was significantly higher than at Delphi. So let's have a look at the nature of the material culture. Oh, what have I done? Okay. So it has been proved that the acquisition of ready-made association is more economical for our brain because it requires the activation of a minor number of neurons and less energy. So other things being equal, people will try to minimize the cognitive effort, adapting the simplest and the least powerful processing strategy that satisfies minimal contextual requirements, which means that conformism has many benefits in terms of the success of transmission and safeguarding of a set of ideas like culture and tradition. So our organism, brain included, usually chooses the most economic and effective way to face new situations. So the choice to keep many of the same objects as those in Delphi is in line with the described mechanism. The sanctuary of Claros and Didyma reached their highest level of popularity during the Hellenistic period. By that time, the sanctuary of Delphi had clearly cemented its hegemony and centrality in terms of divinatory practices. So people associated certain objects and proceedings to the act of connecting with Apollo in order to foresee the future. By the Hellenistic period, those objects and proceedings could indeed be defined as ready-made associations. Thus, the engagement with the same material culture at the sanctuary of Claros and Didyma facilitated the acceptance of a new place designated for divinatory practices. On another level, the complex system of beliefs, myths, and ideas that was in Delphic pilgrims' background and that worked on their cognition was much weaker in the Hellenistic period. We do not have the time to go through everything now, but an analysis of the social context shows that a crisis of the Olympian religion was recorded, and the concept of Olympian gods is now inadequate. The new philosophical currents undermine the power of the gods. Considering the new allegorical interpretation of myths, we realize how the symbolic and allegoric aspects of all the objects involved in divination were much more important now than any other property of the material culture previously mentioned. At Didyma, the seat of the prophetess was a simple axle now. The shape of the object was not important anymore, as the object did not have a rich mythological background. The only thing needed was a special seat for the prophetess to be seated on and to remind of the position of the Pythia as Delphi. The item lost all the cognitive associations that related to the original tripod. It became instead a mere symbol of contact with the god, whose agency relied on associations with Delphi. As for the Laurel, not only was it worn by the oracle, but it was also everywhere in the Adoton, growing from the earth. So the myth of Apollo and Daphne was surely still known. However, it was probably by then only an axiological myth that explained why that specific plant was sacred to the god. At Didyma, the plant had lost its symbolic meaning of the beloved nymph of Apollo. It was instead an offering to the god, a way of honoring him by dedicating the entire room to his symbol in order to nurture his apparition. Furthermore, the high quantity of branches in the room highlights the fact that the associations linked to the Laurel that we described earlier were getting weaker and weaker in the Hellenistic period. One branch of Laurel was not enough anymore to stimulate the oracle seeker's brain. Okay, so let's move to architecture now. Okay, so as can be seen, hopefully, from the examples given above, I listed a series of temples and all the characteristics of these temples. So the layout of the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi was not that original compared to the other one listed on the slide. The temple of Apollo at Basse, in comparison, was much more eclectic than Delphi. Across the Greek territory, people could see and experience pre-literal Doric temples like the one in Delphi with similar layouts. So with a stylobate, with a peristyle, with a number of columns that did not vary significantly, a small pronaos, an elongated cella with 2 rows of columns, and a farther smaller chamber past the cella. So the visitors might have been used to moving around this kind of spatial organization. The architecture itself was not striking. In order to understand where the originality of the Temple of Apollo lies, we need to consider the position, the location of the temples presented above. So these temples were all built in areas quite easily reachable by passers-by, not much above the level of the sea and in a welcoming landscape. Their positions allowed the light of the sun to directly reach their interior, which would soothe the dark and quite heavy feature of the Doric style. It is thus noteworthy that at Delphi these features are instead enhanced by the position of the sanctuary up north on Mount Parnassus, and the long shadows cast by the unusually high horizon that the Phaedriades create. So the temple's location on one of the highest mountains of Greece also had a huge impact on the pilgrims' experience. And this is indeed where the originality of the experience of the Delphic sanctuary lies, in its location. The high mountain range rising around the temple's entrance, combined with the north position of the entrance of the sanctuary, meant that the sun would rise above the mountains relatively late in the day. And in winter months, particularly when the sun moves in lower altitudes, little light would have entered the structure. A situation that would not change until the days become longer following the spring equinox. And in the archaic period, the consultations were performed only in the period that corresponds to our modern month of February, so not longer after the shortest day of the year. As a consequence, during those performances, no direct light was reaching the inside of the temple, making the atmosphere significantly dark. Okay, so focusing now on the Adoton, which was the room where the actual act of divination was carried out, This room, where the Pythia was contacting the god, was probably just a step or two below the level of the temple. But despite only being only a step or two below the level of the temple, it was referred to as the cave, or the vaulted cell by the Greeks. It was located in the western side of the temple and oriented in the direction of the sunset. It had a rocky floor through which it was possible to see the natural fissure from which the sacred gas was emerging, the sacred gas that was believed to inspire the Pythia, as well as a burst of water that was coming out of the rock from the spring Cassotis. The main architectural feature of this chamber is not its being located at a lower level, because it was not significantly lower, but its uncovered floor. So the immediate contact between the Pythia and the ground was fundamental, because despite being artificial, this environment sent the same cognitive stimuli as a proper natural cave. It was difficult to reach. It was crossing the border between the worlds of the familiar and the unknown, and it afforded diminished vision and changes in olfactory and auditory perception. These elements created a situation in which lack of stimuli led the mind to focus on every minimal stimulus the environment offered, so that any rare sound or spot of light became a stimulus for vivid hallucination, which I hope is not happening tonight after this dark setting. In such a context, so phenomena like confirmation biases and Bayesian inference would have played an even more important role than in normal condition. Let's open a very brief parenthesis on theory and how the brain works. So scholars have developed the concept of the human brain as a prediction engine. What does it mean? It means that the brain uses prior expectations in the cortex to look at the reality, and it uses the unconscious mechanism of prediction, error, update. According to the event segmentation theory, the perceptual system spontaneously segments activity into single events as a side effect of trying to anticipate upcoming information. This means that the human brain contains sequential predictions used to predict what will happen next. In other words, our brain prefers to anticipate instead of reacting quickly. And it's, again, the most efficient option for us. So the human brain is essentially a prediction engine. And what we perceive of the world has been defined by scholars as the brain's best hypothesis of the world. These predictions are called Bayesian inferences. And Bayesian inferences are then constantly compared with what happens in reality and consequently updated. By focusing on the sensory input that does not fit its prediction, the prediction error, the brain comes to represent the world accurately. So when sensory inputs conflict with prediction errors are passed up to the neuronal hierarchy, and they allow the brain to update its model of the world. One of the features of this mechanism, and the more relevant for us, is that it depends highly on prior knowledge. So event models are constructed through the interaction of sensory inputs with stored knowledge. So the weakness of this type of functioning is that depending on prior learning, the brain is limited by what it already knows, which can lead to false inferences sometimes and errors in some circumstances. In a state of sensory confusion, the brain usually tries to make sense of what it sees by resorting to prior knowledge and expectation again. So it falls back on Bayesian inferences and is affected by confirmation biases. These cognitive stimuli relate to every average human being. And for the human being, the overall of entering an attic, for example, is very different from the one of going down into a cellar, if you think about it. So in the first case, going up the stairs marks the ascent to a more tranquil, serene space where fears can be rationalized, where it's very bright, while in the latter, darkness and shadow prevail. And the rationalization is less rapid and clear. So building on this, The Greek people believed that caves were passages to the nether world, places where divine inspiration was facilitated, especially in the case of Apollo, where caves sacred to him in several places. So the set of these cultural and cognitive aspects made a place like the Aduton an excellent setting for the encounter of the Pythia with Apollo. But let's have a look at Claros, that is even more interesting. So the original project for this temple wanted the temple. Wow.
Surprise.
But the original project wanted the temple to be a peripheral Doric courtyard temple. Okay. Okay, so the remains at Claro show that the external area of the building was made of a rectangle, 6x11 Doric columns. And the use of a Doric style in Asia Minor. Okay, so the use of the Doric style in Asia Minor and in the Hellenistic period is quite unusual. However, the choice of the Doric style mimics the building of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi and is one of the many attempts to resemble the Delphic model and find justification for this new location for Apolline divination. But let's move to the interiors. So the first floor of the temple resembled the structure of a typical Doric temple. So just as at Delphi, from the pronaos, one could enter from the pronaos, walk into the cella, and in the cella there was a gigantic statue of Apollo, Artemis, and Leto. But the temple at Claros also had a peculiar, somewhat labyrinthine subterranean floor under the first floor of the temple. So the underground chambers could be reached by going down two symmetrical flights of stairs, and from the two sides of the pronaos, these flights of stairs led into a very, very narrow hallway that opened into a large chamber with benches on two sides, where the pilgrims would wait. So the flight of steps were 13 meters long and led into a tunnel that ran for 25 meters and that changed direction. In these 25 meters, it changed direction 7 times before opening onto the pilgrim's room. So this tortuous tunnel was also extremely narrow again. Only one man at a time could walk into this tunnel, could fit into this tunnel. These are the ground floor with the tunnel maze and the two chambers and the general modification of the layout from a courtyard temple to a crypt temple happened in the 4th century BC in correspondence with the shift from cleromancy to inspired divination. So this is fundamental to inform us that the sanctuary is at the service of divination in Claros. We could even claim that it was built to help a successful divinatory ritual. So the pilgrim also approached the stairs and the underground tunnel at the end of the long way to reach Claros. So in comparison with Delphi, the path that led to Claros was quite linear and surely not as steep as the Delphic one on top of Mount Parnassus. But and the pilgrim would normally reach the coast close to Claros by sea. So the journey to the sanctuary was surely, quite long and tiring, but not as draining as the pilgrimage to reach Delphi. So it looks like the complications in the layout of the sanctuary at Claros, they compensate for a journey to reach the god otherwise too easy and accessible. Also, this architectural choice had an impact on cognition, of course. So since the pilgrims reached the sanctuary after a journey lasting for days, if not weeks sometimes, when they accessed the temple, they would have been full of expectations for the end of their pilgrimage, the final encounter with the god. The prophet also had been fasting for 3 days before encountering the god in preparation for the ceremony, which means that his body was even weaker than the body of the oracle seekers. And the same cognitive stimuli also impacted his brain. It is important to stress here that the consultation Claros happened during the night. So this means that the only possible direct light that the building was receiving was the feeble light coming from the moon when it was full and when the weather was not cloudy. And even when outside it was like the outside area of the temple was slightly enlightened by the moon, descending the stairs, the area around the pilgrims was becoming darker and darker. And darkness and the seven turns disoriented the pilgrims. Additionally, small metamorphoses were inserted in the temple's walls, and those together with the use of torches would have created peculiar light effects. So this atmosphere was probably creating a feeling of ambiguity, uncertainty, intimidation, and anticipation before consultation. When experiencing ambiguous situations, for our brain, the safest option is to assume that something is either dangerous or supernatural. And it is a vital instinct of human beings. As a consequence, our senses are alerted. So on the same line, beliefs in invisible and intentional beings are so widespread because they are a byproduct of intuitive human reasoning. Biases in these intuitions evolved to enable us to survive. It was adaptive for our ancestors to interpret ambiguous sounds as potential threats. And I will explain why with the last parenthesis on theory, I promise. Okay, so agency detection. Agency detection is the capacity to recognize intentional behavior from cues in the environment. The fact that we have low threshold for agency detection is a result of our evolutionary past. Over-detection is simply a better evolutionary strategy than under-detection. The primitive function of this device was the detection of predators. However, this system has been defined as hyperactive, meaning that human beings are prone to find agents around them. As a byproduct, humans are susceptible to infer the presence of supernatural beings, especially in uncertain and dangerous circumstances. It is fundamental to consider, especially in relation to divinatory rituals, that HADD, so hyperactive agency detection device, can be not only stimuli-driven, but also context-driven. This means that the specific surroundings can activate HADD and make us prone to identify the presence of agents. The context in which divination was performed can easily drive HADD. The ritual was usually enacted in dark places, natural or artificial caves, and imagining things is easier in low sensory and poor visibility conditions. Furthermore, the procedure involved a series of passages that by tradition favored the encounter with Apollo. Many elements of the context at the sanctuaries that housed divinatory practices induced HADD. And so we were saying that as a consequence of HADD, humans will always try to fit an agent model to a phenomenon before other models are tried. However, the human mind does not stop there. So our brain normally ascribes sentience to agents and tries to interpret their intention, assuming that agents always have minds. And this phenomenon has been called the theory of mind. So, as usual, biological mechanisms in our brain are a result of natural selection, the adaptation caused by past problems. And in this case, the theory of mind, TOM, is fundamental because it allows us to make sense of the agents that matters the most, human people. So theory of mind underpins our ability to deceive, cooperate, empathize, and to read others' body language. It also enables us to accurately anticipate other people's behavior, almost as if we had read their minds. It underlies our ability to explain and predict the behavior of ourselves and others by attributing to them independent mental states, such as beliefs, desires, emotions, intentions. What is interesting in terms of religion is that HADD, consequently to HADD, our brain assumes that gods are agents, and theory of mind attributes a mind to these agents. And as agents, they can interact with the human world and come into contact with us through the process of divination. So moving towards the end of divination and of my presentation, we're at the end of the solitary descent at Claros in a maze full of turns, dark and cold. And the oracle, the prophet and the oracle seekers at this point, they entered the Abaton. Being underground, it was a very dark chamber, poorly illuminated by some torches. So at this point, the sensory confusion already experienced while walking down the stairs, down the tunnels, reached even higher levels. And as previously mentioned, knowledge that is truly culture-specific, mundane knowledge, prior knowledge, plays an important role in event processing. For example, believing that deceased people manifest themselves in the shape of ghosts leads us to detect the presence of ghosts in a high number of cases. And this is an example of confirmation biases at work. In the case of divination, knowing that Apollo would get into contact with the prophet at the sun tree would make the oracle seekers more likely to recognize the presence of Apollo in any visual or auditory trigger they may experience. If someone finds themselves with unreliable sensory information, such as that described in regard to the interiors of the sanctuary of Claros, predictive models and prior knowledge are given more weight than the experience and interpretation of the reality that is not easily accessible in the moment. If the brain is prevented from detecting any prediction error at all and adjusts the representation of the reality, the predictive representations already installed in the mind should completely dominate the subjective experience of the situation. And the architecture of the entire sanctuary is planned to guide the visitors to reach this chamber with a specific state of mind. And the Abaton itself is studied with the aim of recreating an environment that resembles as far as possible the inside of a cave. Nothing is left to chance. So we do not have the time to analyze Didyma's architecture in detail, but a quick look at the layout is enough to understand that it was as complicated as Claros's, or maybe even more. It was surrounded by what has been defined as a grove of columns and contained again a series of tunnels that led to an underground Abaton filled with Laurel plants. So this is only a selection of all the cognitive inputs the pilgrims and the prophets were receiving during Apolline divination, but I hoped I managed to be convincing in proving that the ritual was successful, not because of hallucinogenic substances, but because of a series of cognitive inputs that the Pythia, the prophets, and the pilgrims were receiving from the context. Now, during my postdoc, I aim to continue working with a cognitive approach, which I'm now applying to a new case study, the female body in Greek rituals. So as I pointed out on many occasions, Apolline divination revolves around the anatomy of the female body. So this made me curious about finding out more about the role of female agency and female bodies in Greek religion. Preliminary research convinced me that the female agency was indeed fundamental in Greek religion, and I aim at demonstrating this further within my postdoc. Specifically, I'm now investigating the cultural associations connected to the female body in religious context to prove that the female body itself was central in Greek religion, but also that female officials were central in Greek religion. So thank you very much for listening, despite everything.
Thank you, Julia, for this enlightening lecture. Can we have a short Q&A? Are you into it? Yeah, any questions?
If there are any questions, or even feedback, please. I'm open to any type of feedback, suggestions.
I cannot see any hands. I wonder why.
Well, when you said at the beginning that there was no sort of fumes that come out, I just, I don't know anything about this, but I just remember hearing a long time ago that there was an earthquake at one point that stopped that, and that then the oracle sort of failed after that point. Is that untrue, or is it?
It's not untrue. So I might have explain the thing in the wrong way. So it's not that there was not gas there. There was gas there. It has been defined as ethylene with a kind of a sweet smell. Even Plutarch mentioned this sweet smell when entering the Aduton. So the gas was there, but there are a lot of reasons why it was not the gas that induced this state of the Pythia. First of all, there were fluctuations in the level of gas, so it was not always there in the same amount of gas while divination was carried out in the same way every time. Second thing, this gas was very inflammable, and torches were lit in Delphi, and there were fires at Delphi. So if we had this type of gas in a high quantity, then Delphi would not it would explode. So yeah, so they made at some point they actually believed that this gas was the reason for this sort of hallucinations, because it is there and in high quantity can induce hallucinations. But they realized that it was not that the gas the origin of the hallucination. Also because if you think about it, the pilgrims and the Pythia were basically in the same area. They were breathing the same air. And why would only the Pythia be induced in this state of frenzy and not the other people standing not next to her but close to her? So there are a series of reasons why this could not be the reason for the state of mind of the Pythia, but the gas was there at during specific moment. Yeah.
I think there's a question on the Zoom screen.
Oh.
Well, there are finances.
She had a question as well.
Yeah, I have a question.
You can go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, until I pick this
Okay.
up.
Thank you very much for this. It is very true that in the study of ancient Greek religion, we hear quite rarely on non-cognitive approaches to the study of religion, even though in the study of religion that has been there for quite some time, even though, I mean, relatively from the end of 90s or something. But I think that, and it is really refreshing. But I want to ask you, but there seems to be, exactly as you started from the point of view that when we get into cognitive explanations, we usually move on the level of explanations of brain and a cognitive reception that is stable. I mean, it is regarded to something that is in the structure of the human brain, as you said, that the brain basically remains the same after the evolutionary process get there. So this explanation would, by definition, be always the same. So the human brain being the same, the explanation of perception being basically the same. Now, when we explain the historical religion, as you also referred to along your lecture, quite a lot of changes in the religion, these chronological changes, and what happened. And sometimes, I mean, these are not so straightforward. They're very complex processes always, and the context bound and regional bound and so on and so forth. But how do you explain this controversy here to combine the explanation of historical change in the religion with the explanation that is actually like it is built on the view of the stability and non-change in this perception of cognitive functions of the brain?
Yes, so the reply to this question lies in the second slide, I think, where I was dividing the two columns. So the neuroscientific rules on one side and then culture on the other side. So I believe that the human brain reacts in the same way to specific contexts that can be codified, but then there's the prior knowledge in our brain and our ontology that comes into play. So for example, we can see the difference between Claros and Delphi. So at Delphi, we did not need all the tunnels, the mazes, and all the cognitive strategies to make the pilgrims believe that they were actually in contact with the god, because the ontological side of divination was very, very strong. They really believed that Apollo was there, that they were going to meet Apollo. So we had this side of culture and prior expectation and stored knowledge that was much more stronger than in the Hellenistic period with Claros and Didyma. So at Claros and Didyma, despite the brain was the same, so it always reacted to dark places in the same way, they needed stronger cognitive experience because the culture changed, their belief system changed. So they needed to adjust because of that. But it's not that the brain changed, it's the stored knowledge and the culture that changed. And in similar ways, if we look, for example, at the Greek magical papyri, when we read about foreseeing the future, the formula is always the same. It's always the laurel, the tripod, a water spring, and yeah, these are the main elements that they were using. So this also proves that these objects became symbols of foreseeing the future. But here again, they were not thinking about Daphne in that period when handling the laurel. So the culture and the knowledge changed, but the cognitive inputs stayed there because of the associations with Delphi. But still in modern day religion, we use cognitive experience, like for example, meditation. The stillness of the body is the symbol of the stillness of the mind. It helps with the mind. Or another similar experience is that while they were going up Mount Parnassus, they were singing the paeans with this repetitive mode. And the breathing, the repetitive breathing would calm down and make them feel as they were actually reaching a place of wholeness. When we recite the Holy Rosary now, it's basically the same thing because we pronounce the same words over and over again, and this regulates our breathing and this calms us down, and it feels like praying is helping us with relaxation, but it's actually our body reacting in the same way as their body was reacting to the singing of the paeans. So the section of the neuroscientific rules is fixed, but then we change what we say and what the tools that we handle in accordance with our culture to make the combination work. So the paean and the Holy Mary or the Holy Rosary. Does it reply to your question?
Yes. I mean, it does, and you're certainly right there. I'm still quite. I mean, I doubt if we can, because this works if you look at the phenomenon, and this would be very refreshing also for the study of ancient Greek religion, I think. And it is exactly as you say, but then we do not need to, as I think, and this is my opinion only, to explain with the same rules the changes in belief system.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean that's a different story, I feel, but we can carry on that
Sure.
later on.
Thank you.
Have a question from Zoom. Yeah. I cannot unmute it.
Okay, I'm on.
All right, we can hear you, I think. Can
What?
we? No, we cannot. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Can you please try again?
Can you hear me?
Now, yes.
Okay, good. I'll talk loud then. Thank you for your talk, Julia. I'm sorry I couldn't hear you so well, and of course there was a lot of stress because of the light. I also work on divination in practices in ancient times, and divinations was a big business both in Greece and in Roman Italy. And there were various kinds, mirrors and so on. I write about the Villa de Mysteri thing. Anyway, you talk about, you started with saying that Pythia probably was not intoxicated by gases or by ivy. However, I've read analyses about ivy berries that they actually contain something that can give some kind of changed mind, if you can put it like that. And if in that crack in Delphi, there might have been gases 2,000 years ago, although they are not detectable today. Just to put some salt into the porridge. Anyway, there are so many other ways of changing one's states of consciousness to attain altered states of consciousness without any intoxication or gases or ivy or anything. You can have a meditative practices. You can have special movements. and also just the practice of getting into another state of mind. And as you said, also expectancies. Also the Pythia, also the priestesses were part of this, having expectancies. And of course, everything about the location that will also work on the participants, those visiting. And you said the brain is a prediction engine. Yes, and we have confirmation biases. You want to experience something, and you do so. Or at least, if it might be very practical, if you made all the journey up to Delphi, and if you don't want to go home to your Greek village and say, well, I made all that long journey up to the mountains and I didn't experience anything. It was just sweat and, we want to have our expectations confirmed. You don't need theory of mind just to explain that. But of course, we want to have our confirmations confirmed. And also because that gives us some kind of security that the world is as we have been brought up to believe it is, that God's take care of us and there are possibilities of getting help from the gods. And yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
but that hasn't,
because we are facing a bit of difficulties here with the lack of light and electricity. Is this your question? Do you have a question? Because we need to finish this.
Yeah, I understand that. No, but the brain aspects are not that complicated. This is very simple brain functions that we also share with animals. They also have expectations that they like to have confirmed. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was looking very much forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions? Yes, please.
Maybe I would, I hope I get this across right, because actually I, as far as I understood it, I liked your presentation and to me it was very convincing. But I would be really interested in what you would say regarding the Pythia, the oracles that you give, so the prophecies or whatever the correct term would be. How much is that influenced by actual knowledge of the world, especially when we go to such famous sayings like to the king of Lydia that one of the realms will be destroyed or something like that. So maybe to be like really to exaggerate, maybe, do you think that this was all just theater and she just acted like she's in trance, and to get this across better? And how much does actual knowledge, political knowledge, whatever, history play a role in that? What would you say?
That's a very good question, because it allows me to also specify that the Pythia were always chosen from farmers' family that lived around Delphi. And they tried to choose younger at the beginning and then old girls, old women after a while, from the farmers that were living around Delphi, exactly because they did not want them to be biased by knowledge. So, and they were also quite surprised by them singing in hymns, because they did not have knowledge of poetry or verse compiling or anything at all. So they tried to choose them from that area specifically because of that. So as far as I know, it was not staged. I cannot reply to I cannot, I don't know if the single Pythias then were all poor and didn't know what was going on in the world, or they were staging. It might be that some of them did, but in general the rule was that they did not know anything about politics or
okay, thank you. I mean, I don't want to take this too far, but I would expect that also it's not the Pythia alone. I mean, there will be a lot of servants, other priests around who will have an influence in her, especially if she's a not knowing anything farmer's girl. So I don't know.
Yeah, it is true. There was a set of priests that were helping her after delivering the word of Apollo. So there were a set of male priests that were actually dealing with the bureaucracy at Delphi, and it might be that they were actually handling the words of the Pythia and changing the words of the Pythia slightly. Although another theory that there is that the people, while waiting for the Pythia to speak, like when you're asking to foresee your future, you have a preference, right? You know what you prefer that would happen. So since the Pythia was talking in riddles, it is also possible that the people waiting for the response knew what their preference was, and then they interpreted the riddles in their own way, making it work with their preference. So there is a lot of ways in which the words of the Pythia were actually changed or like interpreted after she uttered them. But in the process, according to me, she was honest. But who knows?
And one last question before.
Just in that context, if I remember correctly, there's multiple references in Herodotus to Spartan royals bribing the oracle in Delphi, which implies that the concept of bribing it must have been thinkable.
Yes, it was, but it was like very looked down on. Like it was
for sure.
very judged. Yes, yes, yes. But they considered it. But even also the fact that she was inspired, that she was in an altered state of mind was considered, but Plutarch says that the one time where the Pythia seemed distressed and in an altered state of mind, then she killed herself because the condition for her to get in contact with Apollo were not there. The preliminary rituals went wrong apparently, and she reached this very bad state of mind, but she killed herself. So it was not the normality for them, nor to bribe the Pythia, neither to bribe the Pythia, nor for her to be in a very in a frenzy state.
All right. And with this, I'd like to thank you for your stamina and perseverance.